Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of the ultrasound guided regional anaesthesia teaching program. And this time we're going to talk about some techniques that you can use to get better at needling, and some of the ergonomics that might be worth thinking about before you start doing a block. So this is essentially what the ultrasound beam looks like. It's two of its dimensions are fixed, so that the width of the beam is the width of the footprint of the probe, so about 35 millimeters in our case mostly. And the depth of the beam, that's the sort of the anterior posterior depth as we look at it, is about 1 millimeter. And then the sort of the length of the beam, the height of it, is adjusted when you adjust the depth settings. So you can imagine it almost as a credit card shaped object of variable length sticking out of the end of your probe. Now it works a bit like a torch beam in the pitch black. So that torch beam, that ultrasound beam, will illuminate whatever you point it at. However, if you're not pointing it at it, it will not be illuminated. So this is why learning ultrasound guided regional anaesthesia can be quite challenging, because you need to not only keep your target in the ultrasound beam, but you also need to keep the needle in the ultrasound beam as well. Now, as luck would have it, our targets are mostly quite long. If you're going directly for a nerve, that's quite a sort of long target. So if you move it up and down the beam, it shouldn't matter. However, the needle is only just narrower, or only just broader than the beam width. So that's the challenging. The challenge is to keep the needle in the beam at all times. So the other thing to think about is that this sort of credit card shaped beam of ultrasound pivots around the skin. So even if you've got your ultrasound probe directly above the target, it not only needs to be above on the skin, it needs to be pointing at it. So so this is where the pressure, rotation, angulation, tilt, slide from the first or second lecture comes in. So if you can't see your target, or if you can't see your needle, you need to try those manoeuvres until it comes into view. So there are broadly three approaches, or two approaches, that we can guide the needle towards a target. So there are two in-plane approaches, so in-plane and in-plane perpendicular. Now, the best view of the needle, as we saw in the physics lecture, will be attained when you're in-plane perpendicular. So think about that when you're planning your needle path to the target. But otherwise, in-plane and in-plane perpendicular are the same, and across plane or out of plane, we'll talk about shortly afterwards. So this is the key message for this. First off, you need to find your target. So spend some time finding the target and being absolutely clear that that's definitely the target that you want. Next thing you do, as soon as you stick the needle in the skin, you need to find the needle. Now, if in finding the needle you lose your target, you need to take the needle out, re-find the target, and put the needle in again where you can see both the target and the needle. But whenever the needle is in the skin or in the patient, you need to find the needle and see the needle tip. Now, there is evidence that shows novice ultrasound regional anaesthesia practitioners will gain confidence from the ultrasound without actually gaining insight. And on average, they stick the needle in about 2 centimeters beyond where they think it is, because they feel confident that they've got an ultrasound probe in their hand, but they haven't seen the needle. So the message is, whenever the needle is in the skin, you need to see it. And if you can't see it, don't move it. Keep it still until you've found the needle with your ultrasound beam. So you want to either move the needle or the probe, and not both at once. If you move them both at once, you'll get lost. Now bear in mind also that when moving the needle, you can only move it in one dimension and keep it in the target. That's to say, if you want to go deeper with your needling, you need to move it away from the probe. And if you want to go more superficial, you want to move it towards the probe. Moving it across the beam all that will do is move the needle out of the beam, so you won't be able to see it. So you need to think of the beam like a channel, and you can only move the needle up and down that channel, to or away from the probe. And if you're having trouble finding your needle, remember back a lesson and stick your hand on the patient and then hold the probe. It stabilizes it. It gives you proprioceptive information, and it helps you guide the probe towards the needle. So in-plane techniques allows you to, as we said, see the needle throughout its course in the patient. So from going into the skin to reaching the target, you should be able to see the needle and the needle tip. Now, a common pitfall is that you've got a very sort of fine tangent to the needle. So you can see something along the length of the beam path, but what you're doing is just taking a very thin slice of the beam. That's to say your probe and your needle aren't exactly at the same angle. Now that will give you a false impression of where the tip of the needle is, because where the needle exits out of the side of the beam, it will look like a needle tip. Now, one way to get around that is to always insert the needle with the bevel facing up. Now, our ultrasound machines, you can clearly see the bevel when we get it, so that will give you reassurance that the needle is, one, fully in the beam, and two, that you can see the tip of it. So when you're aiming for a nerve in an in-plane technique, you want to aim for 6 o'clock and then 12 o'clock. Now, as a general principle, you want to block deep structures first, because in putting in local anaesthetic, and if you haven't managed to get all the air out of your syringe, you may disrupt the tissues and the view. So you want to block the deep structures first. So head for 6 o'clock and then head for 12 o'clock of the nerve, and try and get a sort of complete circumferential covering of local anaesthetic around the nerve. As we've said already, if the needle isn't in the beam, you'll see nothing. But if it is completely in the beam, you will see the whole needle. So that's an advantage, that you can see the needle throughout its course in the skin. But equally, if your beam is above or below, if your needle is above or below the beam, you won't be able to see it. So what you need to do, stick the needle in the skin, then find the needle and see it through its entire trajectory. And so here's an illustration of a left radial nerve block above the elbow. You notice a deliberate mistake that this person hasn't got their hand on the patient. But the beam, it's important to sort of remember, comes right out of the dead centre of the probe. And there is a centre line marked on these probes. So if the centre line of your probe isn't completely lined up with your needle and pointing towards your needle, then you're not going to see the beam. If it is, you'll see the whole course of the needle, and you'll see the right up to when you get close to the nerve. Now, out of plane, you should still be able to keep as good a track of the tip of the needle when you're using an out-of-plane approach. Now, this will be the approach that many people are familiar with when doing central lines, so central venous access. Now, what you may do with your central venous access is just poke it in, watch for where the deformation is, and assume that's where the needle is going. Now, I'd suggest you can do a lot better than that, and you can follow the tip of the needle through its entire course in the skin. Now, you can do that several ways. The easiest is just sticking the needle in and then angling the beam so it comes down the shaft of the needle, and as soon as you lose signal, just before that is where the tip of the needle is. So then advance the needle a little bit and repeat the process. So advance the needle, sweep down the shaft of the needle, and then you'll see where it is. When you become expert at it, you can actually advance the needle and angle the beam as you move the needle forward. Now that does take some time to get the hang of. So what I'd advocate initially is intermittently moving the needle forward and then refinding the beam. Now when you're doing a block out of plane, what you want to do is aim for 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock on the nerve, so that you can get local anaesthetic either side of the nerve to kind of completely surround it with local anaesthetic. Now the problem with out of plane approach is that if the needle tip is just perfectly in the beam, the tip of the needle is just in the beam, you get a signal like you see on the left hand side. You get a bright white dot. Now the problem is that if your needle is 3 inches through the beam, you will get the same signal. So you cannot keep your probe still and expect to get an accurate idea of where the tip of the needle is. So as you advance your needle, you need to follow it down with the beam. And remember, the beam will only illuminate what it's being pointed at, what it's pointed at. And if you're pointing at the shaft, you'll get exactly the same signal as if you're pointing it at the tip, which may lead to you sticking the needle through the nerve unexpectedly. Now, another Heath-Robinson diagram, but this represents a curved structure with a nerve in it and an ultrasound probe. And there are two approaches that you could take to this. Just the standard in-plane approach, which, as we've seen before, may not yield a very good view of the needle, because the ultrasound beam will hit the needle and then be reflected off out of the limit of detection of the probe. An alternative approach is to move the needle, the insertion point, away from the probe. Now this could relate to the forearm or the abdomen or the neck, wherever you go. If you move the insertion point away from the probe, you'll get a much better view of the needle, and hopefully it will be safer, because you will see the entire course of the needle, and you'll be able to keep a confident track of the tip of the needle. You can see again, get a better view of the needle because the ultrasound is bounced pretty much perpendicularly back to the probe. Now finally, alignment. Our anaesthetic rooms aren't very big, and it can be a pain in the neck to move the machine around after the patient gets there. So if you're planning to do an ultrasound guided block, have a think about where you're going to put your machine before the patient comes in. Now equally, like when you're doing central lines, you don't want to be sort of craning your neck or turning around to try and catch sight of the screen when you're looking in another direction to the probe. So what you want ideally is the probe, the patient and the screen all in one line. So all you need to do is flick your eyes up and down. And again, you want to organise your machine and your probe such that the left hand side of the probe corresponds with the left hand side of the screen. So in this diagram, it represents a right, for example, a supraclavicular block, and a needle entering the left or the right hand side of this probe will enter on the right hand side of the screen. So it makes it easier to interpret a flat two-dimensional image and relate that to the complex three-dimensional anatomy that you're looking at. And similarly, if you were doing a block on the other side, you might orientate the probe the other way around, and still come in from the right-hand side of the probe, which would then correspond to the right-hand side of the screen. And just a few more examples of that. For example, a femoral nerve block, or a femoral nerve block with someone, a left-handed practitioner possibly, or a fascia iliaca block. Always have a think about where you're going to put your screen, where you're going to put your probe, and line of sight from patient to probe to machine being maintained.